It's Sexual Violence Awareness Month, and I'm joined today by 4ZZZ's political reporter, Alexis Pink. Alexis spends a good part of her working life covering Parliament from the media gallery and interviewing politicians from all backgrounds for her show, The Pineapple Rebellion. Alexis, who identifies as a woman, is transgender, and she's some definite views about why consent and sexual violence deserve much greater attention for all our state lawmakers. Welcome, Alexis.
Thanks for having me.
That's all right. Tell me a little bit about your role as a political reporter.
So I've been at 4ZZZ for about 3 years now. I've done many election broadcasts as well as reporting from State Parliament for the last year and a half, nearly 2 now.
What's that been like?
It's been an interesting sort of journey. I didn't start transitioning till about midway through that process. So literally my first day at Parliament, I was maybe 2 or 3 months into transition.
Right. And so
yeah,
you were familiar with that?
What's that?
Were the people you met familiar with that? Did they know you beforehand?
Some of them do and some of them don't. I've met politicians on a regular basis for many years. So some of them had a fairly miffed look, but but most of them have been quite friendly and pleasant about it.
That's great. And so what does your role involve at Parliament so that people understand what you do?
So as a gallery journalist, it's my job to report on the goings-on at Parliament, not just the things that happen on the floor of Parliament, but also the minutiae that goes into decision-making in a political sphere like state politics.
Do you get to look behind the scenes?
We do get a little bit of a look behind the scenes. We're not as in the thick of it as, say, a state parliamentarian would be, but we do get a good idea of how decisions are made in Parliament.
Okay. So how often have you heard Queensland's politicians advocating for more effective laws around sexual violence?
When it comes to sexual violence in Queensland, there are 2 distinct approaches. The ALP tend to take a fairly holistic approach to domestic and family violence as well as sexual violence. They tend to plan out their legislation quite carefully, and they have quite a sort of strong agenda of pushing that through the Parliament. It's probably a reflection of the way that they've built their cabinet, which is quite significantly female-dominated at the moment. The LNP does have significant interests in this area. It specifically deplores all violence, as far as I can tell, but it tends to like incremental changes to address very specific problems. So at the moment, they've been working on a bill around strangulation in domestic violence, which it's not a bad bill, but it is very targeted at one very specific set of cases. It's also likely to hit some amount of resistance, as the Labor Party is probably going to want a more holistic approach than just a specific act that they're interested in.
Is there any evidence at all that these parties take into consideration the LGBTIQ community?
So certainly Labor puts a lot of effort into making sure it's fairly LGBTIQ friendly. So too do the Greens. The LNP, Qatar and One Nation all have very mixed backgrounds on this, especially One Nation, whose leadership is often involved in policies and legislation that are in some way designed to marginalise LGBTIQ communities. Take Mark Latham's latest bill in the New South Wales Parliament. They also tend to vote for bills that are fairly LGBTIQ exclusionary. Take, for example, the Qatar's Australia Party bill about the right to use gendered language earlier in the year, which ended up failing. One Nation, Qatar, and the independent member for Whitsunday, who's now North Queensland First, all voted for that bill. So their records are fairly mixed. The LNP itself doesn't feel that it needs to be directly involved in a lot of these things, it tends to either abstain or support common sense solutions, they say, to these things. When that bill was being debated, they considered the idea of legislating for something like this to be just unnecessary. So they voted with the government to defeat it. But they did give impressions that if they had an opportunity to legislate for it, they would change their approach.
And go ahead with it.
Yeah, and go ahead with something like it. Probably not language as their main thing. They probably had some ideas in mind.
Okay. How effective have recent moves been to tighten legislation around consent?
So it's fairly early days with consent, even though the government has been the ALP government has been pushing this through the law reform process. The report from the Law Reform Committee only just came out recently, and new laws have just been recommended. A lot of the recommendations from the Law Reform Society have been taken on. However, there are still some pretty big question marks around the effectiveness of those laws, especially in dealing with mistake of fact defences.
Women's Health Queensland indeed has made a submission on that very topic because there was a feeling that the reform that's been announced pretty much reflects what's been decided in the courts already, rather than taking it into new areas and expanding the notion a little bit further and making it a little bit more inclusive.
This is not actually an uncommon thing for Labor to do. Their approach over time has been incremental changes to controversial areas like consent. They have an idea of where they want to be, but they don't know if they can hit it all at one time and use their fairly limited political capital in the public sphere to do that. My argument, as far as that is concerned, is there's still quite a lot of popular support for consent laws that are about protecting people in consensual relationships, rather than what they think is going to happen, where a lot of people are just going to get upset that we're over-regulating the way sex and sexuality works.
Why is consent particularly important to the LGBTIQ community?
So we hear a lot about consent in situations with women, and that's the most common phrasing for this. There's still quite a distinct power dynamic involved between heterosexual couples, but those power dynamics also play out quite significantly in LGBTI communities, especially where the power balances are either very similar or where they're quite different. The most common ones you hear about are when homosexual men are arguing over specific consent. But it's not uncommon to hear it amongst trans communities as well, because the power differentials that you experience over time are vastly different, and your experiences of sex before and after transition can be wildly different, just based on that small change. Well, small change, I say, that large change in your life. You go from being, well, for a male to female transition like myself, you go from a position of being, in a very powerful position in a relationship to being one in the traditionally weaker position. And that is quite a culture shock for someone who has experienced that for a long period of time. It's not always said, but it is definitely true.
Thank you. That's a really good insight, and it's something that people don't generally consider outside of their own relationships.
Well, it is hard to imagine someone else's experience like that, and I don't blame people for not completely getting that first time. But yeah, when you live the life the way that I have, for example, you get fairly nervous about starting up relationships with people because that power dynamic is a lot different, especially for someone like me, where I'm still same-sex attracted at this point. That power dynamic doesn't just go away completely either. I mean, for me, having a female partner who recognises me as female, even in situations where they need to be quite vulnerable, is very important, but not always a given.
No, and it's an interesting power dynamic that isn't obvious necessarily to people outside of your immediate partnership.
It's very true.
Is there anything approaching bipartisan support for improving consent laws in Queensland?
So to be very clear, I don't think the Liberal Party or the LNP or the Labor Party have anything other than good intentions when it comes to consent and LGBTI communities. However, sometimes Parliament can be quite difficult to deal with, and it does focus a lot on small changes over long periods of time. For a community that's been battling for its rights for, in public for about 50 to 60 years, that's a really tough decision, especially considering the historic discrimination that they've experienced. But we are getting closer every day. And when we come through with the gay conversion therapy rules and the consent laws that are just coming through now, we're starting to see the seeds of those early pioneers in those areas coming to life.
One of the things that we're trying to do this month is elevate the voices of the LGBTIQ plus community. Now, in Parliament, do you see many examples of, people, they have case studies and they talk about, Joe Bloggs from so-and-so and Jill Brown from somewhere else. Do you see many examples of LGBTIQ cases being raised in Parliament around these types of issues?
We haven't seen this debate come back yet, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what sort of things people focus on when this debate comes for discussion. A lot of decision making about legislation is done behind the scenes, but you can tell a lot about those negotiations by how politicians speak to them on the day. And that was the case with the gendered language bill as well. Both Jackie Trad and the Greens member for Maywa, Michael Berkman, spent quite a lot of time going through very specific examples from their electorate about how that piece of legislation would affect the daily lives of people. And I think we'll see more of that as we go forward, especially from the more progressive side of politics. It's hard to say where the LNP might land on this. There are certainly a lot of moderates in that party that would be more than happy to just live and let live to a certain degree. But I imagine the politics of a party that is so heavily tied up in traditionalism and religion may have a lot of trouble dealing with these sorts of issues. And it's sort of a matter of waiting and seeing as to what might happen there.
So privately, do some politicians seem quite supportive of constructive reform, but then on the floor of Parliament they're obliged or strongly encouraged to vote along party lines?
So in Parliament, at the moment, the culture is around what's known as a strong whip. Largely people vote down party lines, and that's not changing. And even on issues of conscience like this, it is very hard for an MP to cross the floor. Take, for example, Jen Stuckey's choice to cross the floor on abortion and the right to use abortion services. That was heavily pillared by people within her own party, and she left in a storm of controversy to do with bullying and harassment following that vote.
It seems we've got a long way to go.
It is a very difficult environment, and politics is tough. And yeah, I don't envy anyone who has to do it, but we're making progress, even if it's the very slowest progress.
So are there any other laws that could be reformed to reduce sexual violence experienced by Queensland's LGBTIQ plus community?
I think there's a long way to go. Probably the next thing for people in my category of LGBTIQ people, transgender, will be the right to change your gender markers on birth certificates without the need for surgery. And That might come up in the next term of government. Certainly the government has been discussing that, but it's very early days and it is a difficult one to sell to a public that just doesn't necessarily live that experience.
They
To
don't know
them,
someone who's transgender, basically.
well, they might know someone who's transgender, but they may not think about their birth certificates and their identity and stuff like that.
How does it affect you with a birth certificate? Just explain for them, because they may be watching today.
Well, usually it's in formal situations that you have the most trouble. Being able to prove your identity usually comes down to things that are written on your identification, your licenses, your passports, and your birth certificate. And birth certificate is usually one of the most prominent pieces of information that you give away to do things like apply for bank accounts and apply for work and things like that. It can be it can be used by employers to discriminate very distinctly against people in that community without them even knowing that they've done so. Like, if your gender markers don't match what's on your license and on your passport and other documentation, they might even just very quietly not employ you. And it's very hard to prove those sorts of cases in an industrial relations court. So what that community is asking for is the right to be seen for who they are and not be judged for it. And it'll be on top of their list.
That's wonderful insights that you've given us today. Thanks for your time. You're coming into the busiest period for political reporters, and we're wishing you all the best as you chase those politicians around for 4ZZ's The Pineapple Rebellion. Just remind us, where can people hear your program and when?
So you can listen to The Pineapple Rebellion at 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. on Fridays on 4ZZZ. We also have our website, 4ZZZ.org.au, where we have playbacks of that coverage. And also feel free to join us for the election coverage, which will be on Saturday, the 31st of October.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.